Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the art and science of hiring development staff during a pandemic. My name is Husani Bastien, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Charity Search Group. I'm here with Mariya Yurukova, the CEO and President of Charity Search Group. As I mentioned, I'm Husani Bastien. I have a master's in information systems. I am the co-founder of the nonprofit Center for Human Success. I assisted in hiring and fundraising. I have an extensive technology background, and I've also been in executive positions in several for-profit startups. Mariya Yurukova has 15 years of fundraising experience. Throughout her career, she's raised more than $20 million, has extensive hiring and staff management experience. She's also a passionate advocate for nonprofit talent. So I'll give you a quick overview of what we're going to be going over today. First, we'll start with a quick word about Charity Search Group. Then we'll go on to talk about the labor market landscape in the nonprofit industry, the recruitment process during a pandemic, salaries and benefits. We'll also talk about remote working transitions, virtual onboarding, how to spot a good fundraiser, skills for the future, a long-term outlook, and also we'll take some questions and answers. I'd like to also let you know that you may submit questions through the question chat board at any time. So, Charity Search Group. We find top talent for nonprofits. We are the most affordable recruiting service in the industry. We recruit exclusively for the nonprofit sector. We have more than 3 decades of fundraising and staff management experience. We specialize in helping small shops find talented senior fundraisers and executive leaders. We have a proactive and innovative outreach approach. We have thorough screening and detailed candidate profiling. I urge you to connect with us at info@charitysearchgroup.com for a free consultation. And now I will turn this over to Mariya, where she will speak to you about the labor market.
Thank you, Husani. I'm excited to be here today and spend some time talking about hiring fundraisers and development professionals in the middle of a pandemic. I think that we've all gone through quite a bit of a roller coaster in the last year or so with COVID-19 and sort of how this has impacted the nonprofit sector. So I am excited to sort of give you a bit of an overview as to where we are today and what to expect in the future. So first things, we can take a bit of a look back in the last 6 months or so. Before March, I would say, early February or so, we were seeing quite a bit of a talent shortage across the industry, particularly for frontline fundraisers, in other words, major gift officers, directors of development, and then executive director and senior leadership roles. I think that was due to a whole bunch of things, which is an entire webinar on its own. But all the way into the end of February, I think early March, we were really seeing a crunch for talent. And then once sort of the pandemic hit North America, we started to see a bit of a freeze and a ceasefire in the war on talent. And then sort of what that sort of entailed was a lot of layoffs in smaller and non-government funded charities, as well as few organizations still hiring and more people looking. A lot of hiring freezes were happening at that point. And then May, when everyone thought that things could kind of go back to normal, because in the beginning we all thought this was going to be maybe a 2-week endeavor, but it turns out that that's not the case. Those layoffs became a little more permanent for some people. There was furloughs that were now 6 months long, and that process just generally intensified a little bit. But I think as we progressed through the summer, a lot of nonprofit organizations regrouped, refocused, and sort of decided that this is going to be a long-term haul for all of us, and we really needed to get back to business and figure out how we're going to continue to work the work that we do in impacting the community at this point just virtually. So we saw a little bit of loosening and a little more hiring happening, a very longer and drawn out hiring process in general with a lot of uncertainty in the process, virtual onboarding for new employees, and then a pivot to new skill sets that were now in demand that not many organizations would have thought as priority in the past. And then later in the summer and then early fall, we saw some organizations hiring back, and then we also saw other organizations sort of doing a more permanent long-term termination, and then renewed hiring for particular roles, especially at the senior level. And then this fall, I think it really is going to be about the survival of the fittest. I think a lot of small charities, particularly those that are local and funded by sort of a single revenue stream, if you wish, are having a hard time and they're going to be closing. Many small charities are looking at amalgamating or joining forces with others in order to survive. And then there's a shift in focus and strategy for a lot of organizations, and there really is a redirection to do things differently and perhaps be a little more innovative in an environment where we've all been forced to adapt and adjust like never before. Now, what I expect will happen early next year, I think we can look into some cautious recovery. Whether there is a vaccine or not, I think that many organizations are just going to look at doing things differently, but continuing to do the work that they do. And I should also mention that many organizations that did those layoffs and furloughs were expecting a much bigger hit to their bottom line in terms of donations. And then when they realized that that hasn't happened as much, I think now they're feeling a little more comfortable and confident that they might be able to bring some staff back, which is why we're seeing new hiring. And then there will be permanent changes to fundraising practices in general. I think that those large-scale events and galas that we are used to seeing, for example, are not going to come back as soon as everyone thought that they would. I think in the beginning we thought that fall events would be okay. Now we know they're not going to be okay, and it's an even bigger question as to whether events next spring are going to be okay. So I think that we're just going to see organizations pivot into a completely different style of fundraising. So what does that all mean for sort of where are we with the war for talent that our industry has been experiencing in the past 5 to 10 years, I would say, and will continue to experience for the next decade or so, where there is a tremendous amount of senior leadership roles that are going to become vacant because of the baby boomers retiring. But there also has been a lot of growth in the nonprofit sector with a lot of organizations expanding rapidly in the last 5 or 10 years. So therefore, the demand for this kind of skill set has increased. And traditionally, we've not done a good job of reaching back and having a good pipeline of fundraisers because it's not really a natural profession that a lot of people go to university for example. So that talent crunch and shortage is going to continue to be a theme for the next little while. So most roles that were impacted in this particular round of layoffs at a lot of nonprofits that were junior and administrative functions primarily. There were obviously some more senior roles in some organizations, but the majority of the people on the market right now have very particular skill sets at the more junior level, I would say. Small, local, non-government funded charities were disproportionately impacted by this. So naturally, a lot of people on the market would come from those kinds of charities as well. And then experienced, highly skilled professionals are reluctant to make a move. So not only are we experiencing a lot of people in the market with one skill set that may not be what you're looking to hire, but we also have the people that would normally be on the market because they would want to change a job or take a risk, are not willing to do that and are trying to stay put because of the uncertainty that we're currently all experiencing. So that just makes for a very sort of a contrasting picture in hiring depending on the type of role you're looking to recruit for. And there's a tremendous shortage of experienced fundraisers, particularly in major gifts. And that's going to continue to be the case because I think a lot of organizations through this process have realized that major gifts and planned giving and digital fundraising are the areas they need to invest in more than traditional sort of transactional kind of fundraising that they may have been doing a lot of. And then there's going to be a new talent shortage. I think I've been saying this for the last year or so, and I'll continue to mention this around digital communications, around data and communication skills in general, particularly around like video, for example, and sort of online communications. These are skills that our industry is lagging compared to the for-profit sector. And we are going to see a tremendous shortage for this. And I think that what's even more difficult is that in difference to some of the other skill sets that we've seen in the nonprofit sector that have been primarily the domain of the nonprofit sector, with very few people easily being able to transfer in and out. For example, those kinds of skill sets around digital, around data, around communication skills are very interchangeable between the nonprofit and the for-profit sector. So all that to say is that it's going to be even harder for the nonprofit world to attract those candidates if we're not able to compensate the way for-profit companies would, which has always been an issue for the sector to begin with. So we really need to work hard to attract these kinds of candidates and find other ways to demonstrate our value proposition for them. So what has all of that meant for the recruitment process during COVID-19? We're still in it. So as I already mentioned, definitely longer hiring cycles, a lot of stop and go in cycles sometimes, mainly because a lot of people are trying to evaluate how things are going, and sort of originally we're hoping to delay start dates so that they could onboard people in person. That's not quite the case right now. I think people have, for the most part, decided to proceed with onboarding virtually if possible. There's lots of movement and knee-jerk reactions, particularly early on. And what I mean by that is a lot of people that found themselves on the market or were experiencing anxiety thinking this was going to happen to them started to sort of apply for any job there is out there. So early on in the pandemic, what we noticed, and I certainly experienced that as a recruiter myself, is that we would get overwhelmed with applicants with a very similar skill set, for example, that were sort of preemptively applying for roles thinking that their charity is going to close, because if you were an event fundraiser and you had a run in the summer that got canceled, you thought that your job might be in jeopardy. So a lot of those kinds of candidates sort of flooded the market very, very quickly. Virtual interviews are now a normal thing. I've done virtual interviews for years, so that wasn't really an adjustment for me, but I think a lot of people had to work very hard to overcome their fears of hiring someone without ever having to meet them in person, for example. And then there had to be some additional considerations, both for candidates and for employers, where a lot of other things about a job became important, like the benefits and compensation, like flexibility, and like remote work, and sort of what would that look like pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, that kind of stuff. And then some general trends in hiring, because this has been a highly stressful and very emotionally charged process. It's very similar to 2008, 2009 and the economic downturn, where there was a lot of people looking for jobs on the market. And so naturally that came with a fair bit of emotionality about the topic. Same now, but a general trend is that candidates really want to be treated like humans, and they're particularly sensitive to being asked to do too much to apply for a job, for example, or not being communicated to, and they're not taking well to things like algorithms and sort of personality tests, if you wish, and all of that early on in the process. And I know from a hiring perspective, some of these can be tremendous time savers and really give you insights on people. But on the other hand, we have to balance that with what we're asking people to do, knowing that they're not applying for just one job, they're probably applying for 10 or 20 a day. So I want to switch gears a little bit before I go back to talking about the process during a pandemic, but I want to share some quick tips as to how to make this work for your organization if you're looking to be more appealing to candidates. You want to include information about your work culture and values. That's becoming increasingly important. You want to talk about an opportunity or the opportunities that a job presents beyond the responsibilities. So it's not really about you're going to be responsible for handling a portfolio of donors at $10,000 or more, for example, but more around, you're going to be working with donors to impact a great community and secure support for life-saving treatment, for example. That kind of language, I think, appeals to people, and particularly millennials and younger generations as well. You need to post a salary range on a role. I think that's becoming a hot topic, particularly when it comes to diversity and equity. And so you really, despite what one might think, you're just going to save yourself more time if you actually post the job instead of going through a recruitment cycle and just realizing that you're too far off with your preferred candidate. You're better off working with the people that can work within the salary range that you post, not necessarily a specific number, but a range, and give yourself some room within it. But give people an idea of what the compensation looks like. The share the goals and offer performance-based incentives, that's something that is always very helpful and sort of implies that your organization values performance. Encourage candidates to apply based on potential. So it's always important to say something like, if you, even if you don't meet all of our criteria, we would love to talk to you if you're passionate about the work that we do, because sometimes people can take that to mean many different things. So for example, women tend to only apply for jobs when they feel like they meet 80 or 90% of the criteria. Men, on the other hand, apply for jobs when they meet only 50% of the criteria. So if you have a very long list of requirements for experience, for example, and you would like to attract a more diverse pool of candidates, encouraging people to apply even if they only met half of the requirements would give you a better chance that people are going to apply even if they don't feel like they're fully qualified because you're interested in the role, and that's really important to do. You might want to consider visiting your job description with a lens on equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's a thorny issue in and of itself, but a very important one that we need to consider. I think that our industry has not been spared by any stretch of the imagination about the reckoning that we need to have about the inherent systemic bias that a lot of our industry has had over the years, whether it's in our fundraising practices or in our hiring practices, and in the cultures that we have at work. But in job description, I think it's important to remember that a university education is something that not everybody has had the opportunity to achieve. So you may be excluding some very talented individuals who didn't graduate, for example, but did 3 years of college and since then have had a very successful career. There are also other things that we do in how we engage with our profession that sometimes those of us with more privilege would have more access to. The CFRE is a great example. So requiring a CFRE is a great idea. I have one, and I'm a proponent of it. However, in and of itself, it's a very expensive endeavor to pay for it and continually renew it. And some of my colleagues that work in small organizations may not have the professional development budget, and the organization may not be supporting them. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That so that's something to consider, that you might be excluding and sort of creating an added amount of inequity in the job descriptions that you create. I would also say avoid language such as "no phone calls, please," or "only candidates who are qualified will be contacted for an interview," or something to that effect. I understand that what we don't want to sort of engage in too much back and forth with unqualified candidates as when we are in a recruitment cycle, but I think the reality is that people rarely pick up the phone to call a stranger and ask for a job. That's the reality that we live in. Most people are going to send you an email at the very, if they really want to be proactive. So the no phone calls, please, just creates the impression that you want people to keep out. And it seems a little counterintuitive to send a signal that people should not approach you. And at the same time, you inviting them to approach you by applying. So there's a balance there that needs to be created. It's just a little bit of an, I would say, old school language that is no longer applicable, because that's just not the practice most people have anyways. So if whether you include it or exclude it, it's not going to generate a lot, or it's not going to change how many phone calls you get. It's going to change what kind of applicants are attracted to your role. And then provide frequent updates throughout the recruitment process. I think that's something that's really, really important to do. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was doing a survey with job seekers to ask them what an optimal or ideal job search process would look like. And the 3 things that sort of bubbled up on the top, one was, I want the jobs to come to me instead of me having to go and figure out where to find them. So that proactive approach of reaching out to candidates and sort of presenting opportunities to them is something that job seekers prefer over them having to scour through multiple job boards and organizational websites, etc. The second piece that came to was the part about they want to hear back from the employers and sort of know where the process is. I think something that frustrates people a lot is when they apply for a job and they never hear back and they don't know what happened. They don't know if anyone looked at their resume or they didn't at all. So it's easy to automate some of that process, but it's important to keep in touch, and that changes the way people view the recruitment process, even if they're not the successful candidate. And then the last piece, when they are not the successful candidate, is providing them with feedback. So hard to do. No one likes rejection. No one ever likes rejection. However, it's really important that you provide some feedback to those final candidates, because if they came close to being hired, chances are you're going to have a role in the future. So you want to keep them in your network, and you want to make sure that they have a positive impression of your organization. And the only way to do that is to give them some feedback. Whatever the feedback is. I think obviously there's some liability and legal implications as to how you provide feedback, but it's important to. I wanted to spend some time on this because I think it's important, and a lot of people wonder how to do that. So now we're going to talk a little bit about compensation. I think that's a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, but one that needs to be looked at from a pandemic perspective as well. The COVID-19 effect. Salary growth will slow down short term. I think before that we were seeing traditionally strong increase somewhere in the 5% range on the average salary in the industry. I'm not really talking about people getting 5% annual raises. I'm really talking about what the average salary in the industry looked like. It had been growing for quite a bit of time. I don't anticipate that will be the case short term. I think that the gap between how people are compensated in smaller organizations and bigger organizations is going to get even wider. Not so much at the more senior roles, but at the very junior roles. That I think is going to be the case. And then there will be fewer, more specialized roles with higher salaries. And that could be a good thing. It could also lead to a lot of pressure on these people to be able to kind of do two people's jobs in a way. But I think a lot of charities are looking at this and thinking, instead of having a lot of people doing some things, what we'll do, because we can't afford to hire 2 or 3 people, we're going to hire one person, but we're going to give them a large salary so we can get like the top talent possible. And that can attract someone who's very qualified, but the reality is that there's still only one human. So I think that that's important to keep in mind. And then there's going to be an increased emphasis on benefits and flexibility. I think that is going to be the case for quite a bit of time. And I think never before have we had a case where sick leave has been as important as it is now, and where the flexibility to be able to work from home so that you can take care of your children if they're not going to school has been just as important. So these are the type of things that are probably going to be even more important than salary. And it's one way that you can negotiate with potential candidates if you're not able to meet their salary expectations. Now, a couple of notes. This comes from the AFP salary survey that they do on an annual basis. This is for 2019 data, so there's some that's missing. But did you know that women in general make about 15% less than their male counterparts, even in a female-dominated profession like the nonprofit sector, where 75% of employees are women? Generally, someone who's been a certified fundraising professional tends to make about 70% more than their colleagues with similar experience that don't have a CFRE. And then the average salary for an experienced fundraiser in the industry is about $83,000. And that may come as a shock to you. It may be about average for everybody. Of course, that number is very dependent on geography. It's very skewed because these kinds of salary surveys are sometimes overrepresented with large organizations. But it gives you an idea of what this kind of skill set demands, if that's what you're looking to hire. You don't want to be too far off of that number because that will impact the skill set and the experience of candidates you're able to attract. And then the one important piece, which we're going to come back to in a couple of slides, is the annual increase. That's usually been the case in about less than 2%. So what I mean by that is if you're making the average salary of $83,000 at a particular job, your salary from year to year grows at below inflation rates, if you wish, which is contributing to our turnover issue in our industry, because if the average salary in the industry is going up by 5% every year, and you're getting only 2% raises, for example, all that's to say is that you will make more money if you change organizations frequently than if you stay with the same organization, and that contributes to the turnover, among many other issues in our sector. So when you are recruiting, it's important to keep in mind that it's not just the the starting salary you need to worry about, but I would encourage you to think about how you're going to incentivize that employee to stay with you beyond that first year. So whether you want to hire remote fundraisers or temporarily remote fundraisers, a couple of things to consider, right? So on the con side, it's harder to create a cohesive team when you have a lot of people working remotely. It really depends on whether your organization can make it work and whether you're set up to do things remotely. It's harder to onboard people virtually. And then staff supervision can be a challenge for some managers. It's more about experience and culture and sort of management point of view, if you wish. So I think one of the silver linings we're going to see through this pandemic is going to be the fact that managers are going to realize that employees can be relied upon to work from home unsupervised and still get work done. But that being said, not all managers are going to think like that on a more permanent basis. So something to think about. And then on the pro side, I think some things that I certainly advocate for when I work with clients is the opportunity to work, have flexibility and work remotely is just more employee friendly. Whether that's because people have a long commute they don't want to do every day, whether it's because they're more productive when they're at home because it's quieter so they're not distracted by other staff, for whatever the reason. Sometimes maybe because they just want to wear sweatpants all day and not have to come into the office, and that's quite okay. That doesn't mean that they can't be productive. But keeping that in mind, that in offering that flexibility certainly makes for happier employees, and you're able to attract people who value that. If you're looking at roles that you're thinking of completely remote, that would widen your candidate pool beyond your immediate sort of commutable area. So that's, I think, is really important if you're looking to consider more applicants. Long-term, it could also result in savings. One, if you don't have enough office space, instead of having to find an extra floor or another building, this will give you an opportunity to save some of that. And I think also if your role is a little bit more remote, depending on where the candidate is geographically, you can negotiate salary a little more effectively. And then generally increases productivity for self-directed staff. So that's a question you want to ask in interviews to make sure that you're getting the right kind of candidate, because not everyone works well from home, that's for sure. So how you go about recruiting for remote employees, I think some questions you need to ask yourself ahead of time if you think that this is going to be the case. And you need to be very honest and sort of do a good evaluation of your organizational culture and infrastructure to answer the question, are you set up and committed to supporting remote employees? Like, is there any aspect of your organization that is not accessible virtually? So that can be your filing system, if you wish, or your employee ID cards, whatever else you can think of. But if you're going to be hiring people remotely, you really want to make sure that you can support them and don't sort of impose unreasonable expectations on them if they're going to be remote. You have to think about where your donors are. I know that in a lot of our fundraising roles, we actually traditionally have done the opposite. We wanted to hire someone local, and then with the expectations that they're going to travel a lot. And so it would kind of make sense that you could also hire someone remote that is in an area where a large concentration of your donors are, that can work from home and then go to donor meetings that are actually a lot closer to them instead of the other way around. You just have to weigh the pros and the cons of that, as we already talked about. And then what is your organizational culture? Like, sort of, are you office people? Or is it the case that only one person ever works from home, and so that person always misses out on conversations, or they forget to be included? When I was still fundraising, I was part of an office that was very much an office culture, and sort of the social visit rounds every morning were a big thing. And whenever I would work from home, staff that was reporting to me would take it upon the fact that as though I wasn't there, and decisions that would normally have been up to me, they would go ahead and make them without me because I just simply wasn't in the office, even if I was actually just working from home, and it would have been a simple phone call for them to check in with me. So something to keep in mind, that you need to think through that. And then you also have to think about liability. So just because someone is a remote employee, our legal system is not set up to deal with that very well. so some of our liability frameworks may not apply or may not just be logical. So you have to think through that as well. But whatever choice you go about it, I think it's really important that you're honest with potential candidates about working from home or from the office expectations post-pandemic. One thing that I'm seeing a lot, and I've had a lot of conversations with both nonprofit organizations and hiring managers, and also with potential candidates, has been around, well, if this role is remote, I could do it remotely, and then eventually when we go back to the office, oh, it's okay, I'm sure the commute will be fine. But I think the reality is that we view commute as much easier when we don't have to do it every day. So if your expectation is going to be that the moment we can all go back to the office on a permanent basis, you're going to expect people to be in the office all the time, or a percentage of that, then you need to hire people with that expectations and give them the option to work from home temporarily. However, if you think that you have the right culture and you're able to eventually accommodate them to be remote employees for a longer period of time, I think you can do that, but you need to hold yourself accountable to this, because my concern right now is that there's a lot of people who are taking risks and applying for jobs to do remotely. At the moment these jobs are no longer remote and they have to commute to the office, they're going to try it twice, they realize it's not for them, and then leave. And then all the time and effort investments into finding a candidate is going to have to be redone. So it's something that you need to think about before you proceed with posting a role even. So a quick note about virtual onboarding. I think you need to allow extra time and build in a lot of one-on-one interactions with managers, because it's a lot easier to onboard someone in person. And during that first week, even if they're not occupied all the time, they can walk around, or there's a lot of communication and impromptu conversations that people are welcoming them. So it feels a little bit less of an idle time. But if you're onboarding someone that's working from home, and they're going to need to be busy every minute of that day, otherwise they're going to feel like they don't know what to do next, because they're not in an environment where they can take advantage of some of these physical structures. So ensure that there's a full schedule of activities during the first week. And I think managers are going to have to play a much bigger role in onboarding staff than even normally, because the support network to onboard someone else with all the other things is just not going to be there as much. And that the technology setup and delivery is going to be critical. And I know from experience, whenever I've been onboarded in large structures, for example, it could take a week for me to get my computer access, my ID card, or my email setup, or any of these kinds of things. And that just can't be the case in this kind of environment. So all that's to say is that perhaps you need to allocate enough time in order to be able to onboard before you bring someone on board in a way to make sure that they're fully set up with this. And then combine structure with lots of one-on-one interactions with new colleagues. So you want to make sure that that person is getting properly introduced to the team, that they have a lot of sort of 15-20 minute coffee chats with people virtually, so that they get that feeling that they are part of a team, because it can be an isolating experience when you're new anyways. Assign them a buddy, that usually helps a lot. But when you're assigning a buddy, make sure that that buddy is accounted for in their workload that they're going to be helping with onboarding, for example. And then offer flexibility and accommodation for childcare responsibilities or other considerations that they might be making. It's a weird time, and normally when you meet someone for the first time and they're new at the job, you don't know what their home situation looks like. And we're now in an environment where that's a big consideration for many of us, because maybe our children are at home and we need to take care of them, and they might be interrupting meetings. But just imagine how stressful that might be for people who are trying to make a good impression, be it during the interview process or early on in their career, and then they have someone come in and interrupt them because their dog ate the Lego. I think that happened to me on a call I was at. So those are just things that you need to keep in mind and allow for that to be the case. So performance expectations for fundraisers. I think this is going to be an important piece as we move post-pandemic as well. So we can't really, fundraisers are goal-oriented people anyways, and sometimes they obsess over their goals. And it's going to be difficult to move away from that, even though there's so much ambiguity about what our fundraising results are going to look like. But in the recruiting process, I think you need to be honest with people about what that activity and fundraising goals are going to look like during the pandemic. So do you expect them to have the same amount of donor meetings? Do you expect the fundraising results to be a certain way or not? And I know that some of these things are impossible to predict, but it's important that you set the stage, and even if you don't have an idea, to communicate that, because I think that that can add a level of stress. And if those goals are challenging to begin with, I think you may turn off some people by not accounting for the extra layer of complexity that the pandemic has put on these. And then the other question you need to ask yourself is, what are those goals going to look like post-pandemic, right? So are we just going to sort of have a gradual recovery where we're going to increase those goals from the virtual world back into a more sort of consistent way of communicating with people? Or are you just going to have like a back to normal switch where if your fundraising goal was $1 million, during the pandemic it's $500,000, now it's back to $1 million the moment there is a vaccine? Like, you have to think through what those are going to look like, because that will impact how you retain some of that staff and also who you're going to attract, because experienced fundraisers who are committed and they understand how to reach fundraising goals are going to look at this and know whether it's realistic or not. So a couple of thoughts on my favorite topic by far. I think I've conducted more than 1,000 interviews in my life, and I continue to do them daily. So I'd like to talk about interviewing a lot. And I just wanted to share some tips from the experiences that I've had, particularly where development staff is concerned. And when I mean development, I really mean fundraisers. Fundraisers are excellent communicators, so you must go beyond canned responses. You need to sort of ask a question and then follow up with an how and why on that same topic. And an example I can give of this is, depending on how you frame the question, many fundraisers are going to talk to you about the importance of relationship building and how the way that they secure gifts is by building a relationship with a donor. That to me is a canned response. We all know that. Like, we've been trained, we all know that that's the case. I think a much more insightful and much more important question to ask is how they go about building a relationship with the donor. And that's one that it takes a bit of insight and reflection and strategy to be able to understand that. And that's when you're going to know what kind of fundraiser you're getting yourself with, right? So there are some fundraisers that are all about building a deep emotional connection and socializing with donors a lot, and knowing everything there is to know about their family. There are other fundraisers who are much more strategic, that focus on sort of the type of activities that are going to sort of create an opportunity to align values, for example, with the organization, or it's showing that you can build trust and follow through with donors when you do what you promise you're going to do. So it just depends on the type of fundraiser you're looking for, but this kind of question is important to ask, because if you're just focusing on relationship building, there you're going to get a canned response like 9 times out of 10. You want to look for fundraisers who have worked on 2 consecutive gifts from the same donor. I think this is a really important point, particularly in a high turnover industry that we're in. I would say 7 out of 10 major gift officers have not done that consistently. They have not stayed in a role long enough to see 2 gifts from the same person. That mainly is the case because a major gift takes about 18 months to develop, and by the time you steward that gift and you position yourself to be able to ask for another gift, especially if there's pledge payments and whatnot, it doesn't happen for very many people. So it's important to ask that question and go beyond the what's the largest gift you've ever worked on or the most complex. They're good stories and you should hear those, but you also want to dig a little bit deeper, I would say. And then the last advice I have is effective fundraisers do things well, not only when they can connect with donors, but also when they can connect with staff internally. That staff can be the gift processing team. It could be the program development staff. So whether that's, in universities, it would be academics, or in hospitals, it would be the medical staff, or in community relations, it could be the community programming staff. Regardless of which way it is, those relationships are just as important, and you should ask the question about how they go about building them. because they are a little bit different than what you would expect if you are building relationships with donors and sort of external facing. Don't discount the phone interview. Not every interview needs to be a video, particularly early rounds. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to do those in the phone and focus on people who are telling you without getting distracted on what they look like and their backgrounds and etc. And it may take a little bit of pressure off of them and give you more substantive answers to questions. And then balance projects and assignments with the stage of the interview. One of the things that we're seeing, particularly with fundraisers, is the job search process is a bit emotional. So once they apply for a job, they start to imagine how they're going to, be in that particular role, for example. And when they start going through the interview process, they're doing a lot of research on your organization, they're getting to know you, and then they get more and more emotionally involved with the organization. If they don't get the job, then they're obviously much more disappointed. And if you add a layer of asking them to do a lot of work, like building a fundraising plan, for example, or creating a presentation to show you how they're going to raise more money for your gala, whatever the case is. You want to do that for candidates that are really at the final stages and you maybe are choosing between one or two. Because if you do this for 5 or 6 people, you're increasing the likelihood you're going to disappoint a lot of people. And keeping in mind they're applying for multiple jobs, they might get to the point where like, you know what, this is not worth my time. So you don't want to turn off people. And I've heard from candidates where they feel like sometimes when they're asked to do that, it's because an organization is fishing for ideas and don't necessarily want to pay people for their time. So keeping that in mind that sometimes it can backfire on you. It's not that it shouldn't be done. I think assignments are great, but they have a place that's a lot later in the recruitment process than early on, I would say. And here's a thought about when to use a recruiting firm. There's many different school of thoughts on that, so this is just my perspective. I think that you should consider using a recruiting firm when you do not have the time and resources to dedicate to the recruitment process. You need to get it done, and you need someone who's going to sort of keep an eye on it and be proactive about generating your pool of candidates. That's when you need to work with a recruiting firm, because if you don't have the time to do that yourself, you're going to sort of delay and extend that recruitment process, which eventually will end up resulting in lost revenue for you, because it will take longer for you to have someone to work on fundraising activities for your organization. So if you don't have the time, that's a good reason why you should use a recruiting firm. And sometimes the recruiting firms can actually be very affordable, so it's not going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars to do that. Another reason and time when you should consider using a recruiting firm is when you have not attracted the right kinds of candidates in the past. Usually if you spend some time with me, I could probably figure it out pretty quickly why that is the case. It could be a job description issue, it could be how you advertise, it could be a culture issue, it could be that just your brand is not well known. Whatever the case is, it's important to investigate a little bit if you don't find that you're generally attracting good candidates or the right kinds of candidates. And then the last example I can give you is when you need a very specific combination of skills and experience that are not easily available in the market. So if that's the case and you need something very specific, then it helps to use a recruiting firm, which will help you weed out a lot of people who may not have those. I think that's important. And I have a statistics down here from Penelope Burke's donor-centered fundraising book, where she talked a lot about sort of staff turnover and what that does for organizations. And replacing a high-performing fundraiser can cost your organization more than $70,000 in lost fundraising revenue. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that when a position is vacant for 3 to 6 months, for example, you've almost lost that entire donor cycle. And it could eventually impact your bottom line. So it's important to pay attention to recruiting fundraisers, I think, and do it right, because it will impact your bottom line. So I want to wrap this up with a sort of a forward-looking perspective. So here's some future skills to hire forward that I think are going to be really important in the next decade or so, and it's good to have them on your team in some way, shape, or form. Resilience and that ability to accept failure and sort of not be too harsh on yourself, or not sort of dig in and try to be defensive. And that's what I really mean by resilience. Innovation and entrepreneurship, and like just willingness to try new stuff, which I think that there's not nearly enough of in our industry. Emotional intelligence, particularly for future leaders, highly important. Data literacy and digital communications is going to be a big skill in the future, and it's going to be increasingly important beyond, I can think in the past, particularly with major gift fundraising, for example, you could get away with people who didn't know the data piece, because data was something that like the IT people, prospect research, and annual giving were into, for example. But I think increasingly we need a lot more of that in major gifts, and hiring major gift fundraisers that are data savvy, I think is going to be really important. Same goes with digital communications. And then that last piece I think is going to be really important, and that's going to be around strategic partnerships and collaborations. And I don't mean those externally, I mean those internally. Because the problems that a lot of our organizations in our industry are looking to solve are becoming more and more complex. And they're going to require more than one approach. And donors are becoming very savvy to that. So it's entirely possible. And by the way, big philanthropists love funding partnerships where a problem can be looked at from multiple angles and worked on from multiple angles, which sometimes means that you would have, for example, a university and a hospital working together on medical research, or you could have a community organization and sort of like poverty reduction organizations working together on neighborhood relations, for example, or something like that. And the ability to work with others in that kind of framework, I think, is going to be really important skill set to have. And so, long term, where are we going with this? Well, I think I'm positive. I'm optimistic. I think that our sector has a bright future. It will just take a little bit of time to recover from what we're currently experiencing. I think fundraising won't be the same for years to come, so I think we should be prepared to adjust a little bit longer term than we anticipated. And I strongly believe that investing in fundraising talent today will pay off for your organization long term. I think we saw that best with organizations that had not been investing in fundraising for a long time, that all of a sudden woke up and were like, oh my God, our typical revenue from that one event we do that now is not happening, we have no other way of making up for it. So I think investing in fundraising talent is going to be really, really important for organizations long term. And hard skills are becoming less important than durable or soft skills, if you wish. That's going to be the case moving forward as well. I think when I was early on in my career, I remember I was on a campaign team that was hiring fundraisers, and their most number one request for fundraisers was that they knew how to work with Raiser's Edge, because that was such a big deal at the time. Now I'm dating myself; that was quite a while ago. But that technical skill of knowing how to work with a donor database seemed to be like the most important thing that people wanted to hire for. Fast forward, I have not seen that as it's now almost an afterthought that you should know how to work with a CRM. It's almost taken for granted. And I think we're going to see more and more of that moving forward as well. And then the nonprofit sector is due for disruption, and we will need to broaden our views on what an ideal candidate looks like. For many reasons, we do not have the talent pipeline in our industry to be able to fill all the jobs that we have now and we're going to have in the future, particularly highly specialized, highly professionalized, and senior level roles. So we will need to reach back and look at other industries that we can attract potential candidates from, and how we're going to transition them as a community. We need to think beyond our sort of traditional approach of only looking at our own people. So that's my take on it. And then I don't think I talked about this nearly enough, but equity, diversity, and inclusion are going to be critical considerations building resilient teams and attracting top talent in the future. I think if we don't look at this for all of our roles today, we should not expect to have resilient teams 5 or 10 years from now. We should not expect to have diverse points of view on leadership teams, or have visible minorities in leadership positions if we don't start doing some of that work today. So that's really important to me. And some of the favorite recruitment projects that I take advantage of is when I can help organizations that are looking to address specifically that. And then I want to finish up with my offer to you. I'm always available for a free 30-minute consultation on any topic about your talent needs that you need, whether it's you plan on hiring, you're not quite sure where to post a job, whether it's you're not quite sure how much to pay, or you're wondering what any question that you might have about how things are going, I'm happy to jump on a call and talk to you. If you'd like to take advantage of recruiting services because you want to have a positive hiring experience both for you and candidates and have a better, more competitive talent pool, I am offering 50% discounts on all of our talent services. And then every month, and so for the month of November, we are picking one pro bono client that we can help with for free, because we know that everyone's experiencing a hard time, but that should not come at the sacrifice of a good talent recruitment process. So if we can help, we're happy to. So feel free to reach out and let us know if there's anything that we can help with. And now we're gonna open it up for questions. So I wanna have a look and see what kind of questions we have. And then I have a few that that hopefully I can address. So the question I got is, how are candidates using Glassdoor to review your hiring process? Are organizations getting burned when their hiring practices being shared when they're less than positive? And how to get around legal ramifications with feedback when you give counsel clients to have candidates who didn't get the nod? To sign a waiver along with the hiring manager to be more transparent. Those are great questions. So I'm gonna take those one at a time. So how are candidates using Glassdoor.com to review your hiring process? So I don't think that the nonprofit sector is actually quite small. And particularly if you look at sort of things locally, I think you see a lot of people who are know someone that works in your organization, for example. Or what would happen is candidate A would say, oh, I'm looking at applying for a job at XYZ, and someone would say, oh my God, I applied for a job there few years ago and they never got back to me, or the hiring manager was very unprofessional, or whatever the case is, right? Or what has happened to me, by the way, is they've asked me an unethical question in a role, and that kind of stuff sort of spreads around. I think big organizations pay attention to things like Glassdoor and make sure that they address some of those issues, but I don't think that we have nearly enough volume unless you're a very big charity that has like 5,000 employees or more. I don't think that Glassdoor is where people go, but I do think that there's a lot of unofficial channels that people approach. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it's entirely possible that someone may not be the right applicant for you today, but they may be the right applicant for you 5 years from now for a different role, and you don't want to leave them with a bad impression now. I think I've seen quite a bit of that, particularly when a client would come and engage with me, and then I would reach out to a candidate and they'll be like, oh, I applied for that job 5 years ago and they told me I wasn't good enough. So that's the type of stuff that you need to remember. Are organizations getting burned when their hiring practices are being shared when they're less than positive? Yes, I would say yes, definitely. I think we're going to continue to see that because we live in an increasingly connected and more digital world, so it's even easier to share these kinds of things. How to get around legal ramifications with feedback? I know that that's very tough. That's sometimes it's helpful to me, but how I usually, because I have to give feedback to candidates when I work with clients, for example. So how I get around this is I give them the positive feedback that I ask hiring managers to give me, and then I give them something that's actually constructive. And it bears reflection as to why you are saying no to a candidate. And when hiring managers don't have a clear idea, because sometimes that's a very gut reaction to people, that's when it's harder. So we move away from talking about why you didn't get this particular job and start talking about, here's a couple of things you might want to do differently. I think that sometimes helps because that's all people want. No one expects to get every job that they apply for. And then I'm going to circle back to another question that got here. If I've listened to the non-chatter or nonprofit happy hour private Facebook group, it is pretty clear applicants are expecting organizations to post not just the range, but the minimum, say 90. What is the work position worth to the organ given the fundraising goals? Yes, I think the range is one, and whenever there is a range, I expect the minimum is the bottom of that range. So if I see a range that's like $60,000 and it's like from 65 to 104, for example, or something like that, that would concern me a little bit. I think that's a bit unrealistic, but most organizations, I think, can post at least a minimum. and sort of an upper range. The thing about the minimum is that when you're posting these things, you shouldn't, most people are going to look at it and say, oh, if the maximum is 90, I'm going to get 90. And so if you offer that particular person 70, I think they'll be very offended. So you have to be careful with how you present those ranges. I think a lot of organizations actually know what they want to pay. I think where this is very problematic is when people say things like, oh, please state your salary expectations in the cover letter. And they use that as a market indicator as to how much they should be paying for the role. Or they use that as I'm going to discount this person because we can't afford them before even meeting them. And I think I've sat across from a hiring manager who looked at resumes and said, oh, this person wants $5,000. It was $5,000 more than what the salary range for the role was, and they didn't even get an interview. And that I think that's silly. So that's where it's more problematic. But the reason why a lot of applicants are expecting the salary range to be posted is also because of equity. We know from multiple studies that women do not negotiate salaries nearly as much as men do, for example. And we know that if you are using things like people's previous salaries as a benchmark, and they were coming from, for example, a small organization, or they have a more non-traditional background, for example, you are basically creating a non-equitable experience. So that, I think, is where that particularly interesting private Facebook group is coming from. But I'm happy to get any more questions. I had a couple. I like the idea of a waiver. I don't think that's going to happen, though. I think that people are way too scared of being sued, which is unfortunate, but I think that's the reality. So I think the bigger question we all need to address is, what kind of feedback? Why are you not hiring people? Because to me, and I do this a lot, when I shortlist people and I don't shortlist people, I have to be very specific and justify why I do that, and I shortlist one kind of person and not another, for example. I want to talk a little bit about CFRE and attracting diverse candidates, for example. So as I mentioned, I think the CFRE is great, but it takes a lot for people to get it. It requires a fair bit of amount in the profession. It also, I think we're going to see the issue of maintaining it come up quite a bit. But I think that there's a big difference between minimum requirements for a job and a must-have, or like a nice-to-have. And I think the CFRE should always be a nice-to-have. It should never be a must-have. That's my opinion on this. Same, I think, goes with a university degree to an extent, depending on the role, of course. And then the issue around diversity, I think, is going to be really important. And there's multiple things organizations need to do in order to attract candidates of diverse background. And it's not, I cannot give you a silver bullet solution and say if you just did one thing, it would work. But I think that we need to get a little bit better at talking to people and treating them like humans when it comes to the job search process, because when you look at people on paper, you don't get the full story. And that's never more true than when you're looking at diverse applicants, for example. If you have there's studies have been done where if you have a first name that's unpronounceable, you're less likely to get an interview, for example. That kind of stuff shouldn't be happening, and I think we need to do better at that. But I do want to thank you all for participating, and these are great questions, so I really appreciate them. And I look forward to connecting with any of you if you're interested in doing so. I'm happy to, always happy to get a call and hear from you and help you brainstorm whatever your concerns are. If there's anything I can do to help, feel free to reach out. We're here to support you through this time, and I hope that this was helpful. Thank you.